What I want to do in this video is to introduce you to Perpetua. So that's your reading for this week. It's one of my favorites, although it's one of the most heart-wrenching of all of them. I think it's easy to read, but hard to comprehend in a sense. But a beautiful story about a young girl's devotion to Christ. We will have talked in the class lecture a good bit about the martyrdom, so that kind of introduces the this reading of Perpetua. But I want to just give a little bit more background to this as well to help you with your reading. So I want to start kind of more broadly with the Roman religion. We talked somewhat about why Rome persecuted Christians, but a few specifics are helpful here. So, the Roman world, as Thales said, in his mind, the world is full of gods. That's a quote from Thales. And they saw gods, lowercase g, occupying every sphere of life, both in terms of spheres of life like motherhood or fatherhood or being a soldier, spheres in that sense, and also the physical spheres, the god over this area or that area, or the god of storms, anything had a certain god attached to it. Augustine, interestingly, makes fun of these gods. Like, they're so weak, you need 4 of them to guard the front door, he says. But the Romans took these gods very seriously. The Romans saw themselves as sort of living in the world that was occupied by the gods, or maybe better, the Romans saw themselves occupying the world of the gods. And it was not very good if you were to occupy somebody's world without acknowledging their presence and thanking them for your daily provision. So you can easily see how Christianity would begin to upset the Roman religion and culture, because Christians are going to see that it is not that local deity, but the local deity doesn't even exist. It's just a fabrication of their imagination, but rather it is the God over all who does exist, and we must honor him. Anyway, so you have this world full of gods, and life is ordered around those gods, inasmuch as life is also very traditional, traditional values, in the sense that nobody in Rome was trying to go off and do their own thing. They didn't want to have the new, the exciting. No, they wanted to fall back on what had always gone before. I mean, think about it. Rome has been around by this time for 700 years, or beginning of the persecution period, maybe 600 years. That's a long time. America's been around 200 years. That's a very long civilization, and they were interested in keeping it. And so they didn't want to suggest something new. Rather, they wanted to go back to what was old. What was old was valuable. What was new was dangerous. Another reason why Christians were in big trouble. And also, that explains sort of why they argued the way they did. They always wanted to show that their religion was actually in keeping with a lot that had come before it, with Judaism. And they tried, somewhat unsuccessfully, I believe, to show the continuity between the Greek philosophy and Christianity. But anyway, getting off the subject here. The family was also very important. So in this reading with Perpetua, you will see that she has conversations with her father, emotional conversations. It would be normal for a father to love his daughter. That kind of love was not abnormal. That would be very common back then, if you were not a slave. Well, if slavery gets involved, it throws everything out of whack, especially for young girls. But Perpetua was not a slave. She was born in a free family, a well-to-do family. Her father would have had slaves himself, and her family would have been well off. And her father would have been charged with keeping the Roman customs. The father would have been charged with keeping the traditions. He would have wanted Perpetua to sacrifice to the gods that would be over her in her girlhood and when she reaches adolescence and then goes on to marriage. The father would have seen to it that she would have done what she needed to do to satisfy those deities during that time in life. And all of this is really just reinforcing the traditional family values for Rome, which would include bearing of children, because you needed to do that in order to keep the society going. I mean, the society they're wanting to try to perpetuate what they have, and so they are reinforcing those things that would be good for Rome in the religion and in the family, and Perpetua would be feeling this in her life. And then, related to this reinforcing of these values, you have the emperor, who is like, as the father is reinforcing things, tradition, the gods at the local level, the emperor is doing this at the national level. And he's doing this so much so that he would also be seen as a god. So he is, in some sense, the mediator that stands between the gods and the people. He is called Son of God, he's called God, he's called Lord. All the titles that are used of Christ are used of the emperor, which again shows you where that clash is inevitable. And part of the sacrifice that would be required would be to sacrifice to the emperor, which would be to show your allegiance to the emperor. And this again would just reinforce the Roman values. Now, Perpetua, though, was not in Rome. She was in Carthage, which is a city in Africa, in North Africa, a large city of about 400,000 people. So, think a little bit smaller than Baltimore, right? That's a big city back then. A lot of people were there. And it was a city that was, prided itself on its intellectual and life. There was great learning, great thinking. There was an arts culture there. It was, you would say, a very livable city. People enjoyed being there. But before it was a part of Rome, there were other influences there, and Rome sort of built on top of a very violent kind of religion. So it had the city would have had a history of human sacrifice to it, which figures into the Perpetua story. It's one of the reasons why she's killed. That's part of the culture of Carthage, is that human sacrifice. But we're describing the world that she lived in, the Roman world. But of course, she became a Christian, right? I mean, she heard the gospel. There were Christians all over North Africa. A number of notable Christians came around during her time, she being one of them, the first woman to have actually written something quite notable for that reason. The first Christian woman, rather, to have written something that has survived. So that's very significant. But there were just Christian communities all throughout North Africa. It was spreading by this time. If the beginning of the first century, it kind of looked like Christianity, from a human perspective, by sight, would not survive. Obviously, they knew by faith that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. They believed Jesus' word that the church would survive. Nevertheless, you were going to wonder, really? I don't see how that's going to happen. If that was the case at the beginning of the first century, by the end of the first century, coming into the second century, we now have Christians all over the place. We have, worship, they're building church buildings. That's because the persecution was not constant, it was intermittent. And there were times where it would be relatively peaceful. You could build church buildings, you could have Christian schools, you could develop the intellectual and social life of Christianity. And the church looked like, in the second century, it was doing pretty well. But of course, the persecution comes. It always comes. And as Jesus said, it always will come until he returns. We ought not to be surprised at that. And it returned to this group. But a couple other things, too, just about the Christian community. While there was great continuity between the various Christian groups, I mean, they believed the same gospel. They called on Jesus in the same way. There was also diversity as well. I mean, this is before we have the creeds that are solidifying things. And there are differences. Now, it's interesting though, because when you read the Christian writing, even before, for instance, the word Trinity is mentioned, you see evidence of Trinity, and you see evidence of Trinitarian thinking in their writings. And even before the deity of Christ is clarified in the Nicene Creed, for instance, the church is almost universally talking about Jesus in the same way. So you have a lot of just core Christian Orthodox doctrine already, just being the norm, and you have just a lot of continuity, but you have discontinuity too. And in North Africa, you have branches of the Christians there are significantly giving themselves to dreams and visions, and they're less structural in their understanding of church, and it's a lot more spontaneous. And it is less dependent upon preaching and more dependent upon people, often women, receiving visions and then sharing those. So when Perpetua talks about the visions that she received in jail, which is a significant part of the document that you're going to read, this is not abnormal to her time. This is what not everybody was doing. Not everybody was having visions, but everybody was going to be hearing visions from others. It was a normal part of their Christian experience. Now, you'll also read about Perpetua going into the arena, the gladiatorial games. This is the really tough part to read it, just to think about what a human would do to another human. How do they actually get to the point where they were doing this to other people, where all of society, almost all of society, was complicit in the creative execution of Christians, and that it was considered a public good that this was going on. But of course, we can ask that about all sorts of things, about the Holocaust, about slavery, about abortion, all sorts of things in society end up raising this question: how could everybody have been part of this? And yet we know with the fall of humanity, we are sinful through and through, total depravity. We can end up buying into all sorts of evil and terrible things. But a couple things about the gladiatorial games. They were, as you read this is going to sound strange, but they were about purifying the Roman citizens and binding them together. I think one of the things that is in sort of our imagination now that might capture what's going on here, and maybe you even think of this as you read it, is the movie The Hunger Games. And if you've read the books or seen the movie, it's not all that dissimilar to the gladiatorial games. I'm sure somebody in the director, writer had at least thought of those games, the gladiatorial games, as they're conceiving of this idea. But really, just like the Hunger Games, it's the idea that you're going to have blood that is going to be about remembering the past, where we've come from, and purifying us for the future, and about making us into a more noble people. That's what they thought the gladiatorial games were doing. And there was a strong sense of purification by blood. In other words, it is a counterfeit atonement, because it is not Christ, not a willing sacrifice, not for the purpose of getting rid of our guilt. It's for this sense of collective purification. And what would happen is the people who were going to be sacrificed in these games, they would be dressed in white. The idea of showing that they are being purified by this blood ritual, and so are the people. And there was identification between then the people and the victims. They were to identify with the victims, see themselves in the victims, and then think that they are being purified as these victims are going to their violent death and having purification in their violent death. One person writes this: the purpose of the sacrifice is to restore harmony to the community, to reinforce the social fabric. Everything else derives from that. So, you have the idea that society is not the way it ought to be. So we need a sacrifice to fix that, and this sacrifice is going to make things right, purify the people, to keep society going. They worshipped these gods, but kind of scratched below the surface, they worshipped themselves. They worshipped their traditions. They worshipped who they were as a people, and they would do anything, even cause the violent death of others, or sometimes the violent death of themselves, to keep that tradition going. The gladiators, the people being sacrificed in various ways, would have a sacred meal, and this was to purify themselves for what they were doing. And the other thing that's kind of interesting here, and you'll see this in the in what you read, is there was much effort to make the spectators participants. In other words, they tried to make this about reality TV. So real, well, it was very real. It was playing right down in front of them. But even though they would fit, thousands and thousands of people in the stadium, they would make the acoustics really, really good, so you could hear the screams and the all the sounds that were made in the death. You could hear that. And they also try to make the seats very high so that nobody would be that far away, and you would feel like you were there. Well, on top of that, the emperor, who would attend, of course not in North Africa, but in Rome, could order somebody in the stands down into the games. So when you went to the games, when you went to see this show, you never knew, you always knew that it could be a possibility that you could be ordered down there and you could end up giving your life. And that was part of the excitement of it. It was that it was a testing of themselves. Could they watch this? Could they be strengthened by this show of valor and death? Through the death of another, they would gain strength. Again, a false counterfeit atonement, evil and sinful and destructive for so many individuals, not just the Christians, but the thousands and thousands of people, minorities, who were sacrificed in this way. But that was what the games were about. So I hope that gives you some background information here. The idea is that you can watch this short video and gain some context for your reading, but now it's your turn to do the reading and give a summary. Again, you're not trying to give background information in in your summary. You're just trying to take the document itself and tell me in one page what does it actually say. So look forward to reading your thoughts.